Imagine being a teenager and stepping into a courtroom not as a witness, not as a bystander, but as the accused, facing the possibility of life behind bars. These aren't tales of hardened lifers. These are stories of high school students whose choices were so dark they rewrote entire lives. Today we look inside the chilling world of three teenage killers whose crimes shocked communities and left judges, juries, and families struggling to understand how someone so young could do something so final. But this is more than the crimes themselves. It's the moments after, the apologies, the denials, the courtroom silence, and sometimes the haunting lack of remorse. Let's start with the case that shook a Cleveland suburb, Mackenzie Shirilla. She was 17 when she drove a car at more than 100 miles per hour into a brick wall, killing her boyfriend Dominic Russo and his friend Davian Flanagan. Prosecutors said it wasn't an accident. Surveillance and vehicle data, they argued, showed the accelerator fully depressed and no attempt to brake. According to the prosecution, what looked to outsiders like a tragic wreck was, in the court's words, controlled, methodical, deliberate, intentional, and purposeful. In the courtroom, the surveillance footage left the room in the stunned silence. A calm approach, a turn, and then an impact that ended two lives. Shirilla wept and apologized, saying she didn't remember, but the judge found the facts persuasive and sentenced her to prison. Juveniles who commit adult-level violence force the justice system to balance punishment, rehabilitation, and public safety. Courts weigh evidence of intent, forensic data, like black box, accelerometer records, medical history, and mental state claims. That mix decides whether a teen stays in juvenile court or faces adult murder charges. Shirilla was convicted under Ohio law for murder and related offenses. Key statutes that apply to cases like this include Ohio Revised Code Section 2903.02, murder, defines murder and basic penalty range, and Ohio sentencing rules under Ohio Revised Code Section 2929.02, penalties for murder, indefinite terms. These are the statutory anchors prosecutors use to frame the charges and the judge used to determine the appropriate sentence range. The court found Shirilla's conduct met the elements of murder under Ohio law, intentional action causing death, plus related counts such as aggravated vehicular homicide and felonious assault. The state argued the driving was deliberate, not accidental. Shirilla was convicted and sentenced to an indefinite term, reported as 15 years to life in the trial court. Because the crime occurred while she was a juvenile, the court's approach to parole eligibility and minimum terms is driven by Ohio sentencing law and case rulings on juvenile offenders. The conviction also carries collateral consequences, fines, restitution, and driver's license sanctions tied to motor vehicle use in a homicide.
Wow, this is so hard. I'm so sorry. He has a good family. We don't condone what happened, and
The brutal Florida case that stunned the nation. 14-year-old Aiden Fucci and 13-year-old Tristan Bailey walked together into woods near their neighborhood. 90 minutes later, only one walked out. Tristan's body was found with 114 stab wounds, many defensive. An attack so frenzied it broke the idea that kids' violence is always less than adult in its cruelty. Surveillance and investigators pieced together the timeline. Fucci, then 14, was arrested and later pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. In court, he gave a brief apology. The sentence handed down was life in prison, with an eventual review because juvenile sentencing law limits mandatory life without parole for minors. The silence in the court when the sentence was read was deafening. When juveniles commit the most serious crimes, courts must balance public safety with the constitutional protections that recognize youth's greater capacity for change. The U.S. Supreme Court has repeatedly required individualized consideration for juvenile offenders. See Miller v. Alabama, which affects how life sentences are imposed or reviewed for minors. The legal framework is Florida Statute Section 782.04, murder, which defines first-degree murder and the elements prosecutors must prove. For juvenile sentencing, the state follows statutory rules that set juvenile sentencing ranges for first-degree murder. Juvenile offenders may be sentenced to life, but are often eligible for review after a statutory period. Florida law provides direction for juvenile sentencing and review procedures. In Fucci's case, Florida law limited certain penalties because he was under 18 at the time of the offense. Fucci's guilty plea and the prosecution's evidence established first-degree murder, premeditated or deliberate killing under Florida statutes. The grotesque nature, 114 stab wounds, multiple defensive wounds, strengthened the state's case for the highest penalties available to juvenile offenders. Fucci was sentenced to life in prison. Under Florida law for juveniles convicted of first-degree murder, judicially imposed sentences can range up to life. Because he was a juvenile, statutory and constitutional protections result in eligibility for sentence review after a set period. In practice, the judge followed the statutory framework that governs juvenile homicide sentencing and potential review. The family of the victim and the community have to live with the result forever.
2 years ago, I made the worst decision of my life, and I take full responsibility for what I did. What I've taken can never be replaced. Every day I wish I could go back and stop myself, prevent this loss and this pain that I've caused
Finally, the Iowa killing that began over a bad grade and ended with a lifetime of consequences. Nohema Graber, a 66-year-old Spanish teacher known for kindness and dedication, took her usual walk in a town park. 2 students, then 16, ambushed her, struck her from behind, beat her with a baseball bat, then dragged her into the woods, concealing her body. One of the teens posted Snapchat messages that incriminated them and later cooperated. Both pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. The community watched the courtroom as judges weighed youth, planning, stalking, and brutality. The 2 received life sentences with different parole eligibility minimums. One eligible for parole after 25 years, the other after 35, reflecting how judges balance youth with the severity and premeditation of the crime. Social media trails are powerful evidence. Messages, snaps, texts, and location data create a digital breadcrumb trail that investigators use to reconstruct motive and planning. Preventive education, conflict resolution, mental health supports, digital literacy, and early intervention is critical to keep petty grievances from becoming fatal decisions. The teens were charged under Iowa Code Section 707.2, murder in the first degree, which covers intentional killing with premeditation and other aggravating circumstances. Iowa sentencing rules allow life sentences for first-degree murder, but the state constitution and court precedent also require special consideration of juvenile offenders, meaning mandatory life without parole for kids is limited, and courts must account for youth factors when setting parole eligibility. The Iowa Supreme Court has reviewed and affirmed the approach used in these cases, confirming that mandatory minimum parole terms can be applied when the court properly considers juvenile-specific factors. The teen surveillance, Snapchat messages, and plea evidence supported the prosecutor's charge of first-degree murder, stalking, ambush, and a brutal beating that showed planning and a willingness to conceal the victim's body. That combination put this case at the extreme end of juvenile homicide. One teen was sentenced to life with parole eligibility after 25 years. The other received life with parole eligibility after 35 years. Those minimum periods were affirmed by appellate courts, which held that the district court properly considered the unique juvenile sentencing factors while also accounting for the exceptional cruelty of the crime. The Iowa Supreme Court's review confirmed that sentencing juveniles to long minimum terms is constitutional, so long as their youth and other mitigating facts are considered carefully. 3 cases, 3 tragedies, 3 sets of statutes and sentencing frameworks, Ohio, Florida, Iowa, all of which show the same dilemma the justice system faces: how to hold society safe, punish those who commit the worst harms, and at the same time recognize that juveniles are not adults in terms of brain development and capacity for change, a principle reinforced by the U.S. Supreme Court in Miller v. Alabama. That is why each case needs a careful legal read. What law was charged? Which statute was applied? How did the court weigh youth and intent? And what are the real-world consequences for victims' families, for the convicted, and for the community? These courtroom images are not just drama, they are primary source lessons. When you see surveillance, black box telemetry, or social media evidence in court, you're watching how the law, technology, and human choices collide. Our role as viewers is to hold a careful lens, demand facts, understand the statutes that were applied, and remember the human cost behind every line in a charge sheet. Subscribe and follow Red Tape Red Flag on all platforms. And don't forget to like, share, and comment.